I saw Ryan slipped in after the visitors were announced. Ryan, we're so glad to have you back. Let's welcome Ryan. Remember Ryan, our Malone student who made the drive up today, did you? All the way from the campus? Let's welcome him today, shall we? Good to see you, Ryan. Well, good. We have a good hour or so now left for the remainder of our service to give to our keynote speaker, and our panelists, and then a time for questions and answers. So what I'm going to do is begin by inviting our panelists to come out. Let me begin with inviting Dr. D.Sloan to come and find his seat. Let's welcome Dr. David as he comes. You know him well, you love him well. He leads our Wednesday night Bible study, and David, of course, is professor of New Testament. He serves as an adjunct at Malone and a number of other universities as well. I know you also love Dr. Brathwaite as he comes. Let's show our appreciation. And Dr. Renee, also serving as adjunct professor of theology at Malone and other institutions, and also directs the Ohio School of Ministry for the Assemblies of God. Our keynote speaker is Denise Leipold. And Denise, yes, all right. Denise serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the Northeast Ohio Right to Life. And let me just lay down a ground rule or two, Denise, before I hand this microphone over. And Denise is going to share about 15 minutes or so. She has hours and hours that she could share, but she's going to get us started in the conversation. Remember, our topic today is valuing life from womb to tomb. After she shares for 15 or so minutes, then each of our panelists will just take a couple of minutes to give response. And then at that point, I'm going to serve as moderator for a question and answer time. So if questions begin to rise in your mind, start to write them down. We want to try to get in as many questions as we can for our panelists today on this discussion of valuing life from womb to tomb. One final little rule that you might want to keep in mind is that if you raise your hand to ask a question, I do ask you to ask a question, as opposed to maybe giving us a sermon for 5, 10 or so minutes. So we need you to kind of stay on point, stay to the point, stay on the topic, and try to ask a question as quickly as you can and clearly. And then also we want to let the panelists be the ones who give the answers, not us out in the congregation. That's kind of what we're trying to do to have a proper question and answer time. So with that said, we're ready to begin. Let us once again welcome Denise Leipold.
When he told me I only have a few minutes, I wrote things down because if I don't write them down, I'll be here till tomorrow. But I have to tell you, I'm very, very happy to be here. It's very unusual, believe it or not, for me to be speaking in a church. There's a lot of churches that won't let someone speak about pro-life in the church because they consider it a political and not a moral or an ethical issue. So it's very difficult. There's a lot, and I could go on explaining that for a long time, but I won't take the time today. But they do treat issues about life like abortion, contraception, euthanasia as very political, and we all know that it's not. But my message here today is not to point fingers or to blame or to condemn or to judge, because the message of life is one of love. And it's God's miracle of life, and we all know that God is all about love and compassion. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what it means to be pro-life, because a lot of people think that pro-life means being anti-abortion, and that's only a very tiny part of it. Pro-life means that you respect life, like Pastor Sosa said, from the womb to the tomb. And the baby in the back is not 3 weeks old. She's 9 months and 3 weeks old. Her life was created at conception. The minute the sperm and the egg united, a beautiful new life was formed, and that's when we have to start protecting that life. Now, I'm not a theologian, and I'm not a preacher. I'm just a person that is pro-life that happens to be in the position that I'm in. But we do base our pro-life views on both, on both religion and on law. So let me talk to you a little bit, go back to the Old Testament. Now, I can't stand up to any of these people here. Like I said, I'm not a theologian or a professor, but I know what I've learned. And one of the things that we can go back to in the Old Testament is the story of Cain and Abel, because we learn from that story that we are our brother's keeper. I can quote here from the Old Testament. After murdered his brother Abel, God asked him, where was his brother? And Cain answered, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, Cain's words have come to symbolize over time that we do need to look out for our brother or our fellow man. That means everybody, not especially the most innocent of us, like the unborn or those at the end of life that are maybe contemplating assisted suicide, or their families that may be contemplating euthanasia, because God gave us life and only God can take that away. So we need to protect to life. It's important to many Christians, the idea that we are our brother's keeper. That means that we have a responsibility. It doesn't mean that somebody else will do it. And that theme of being our brother's keeper is carried over into the New Testament. What greater way of being our brother's keeper is that than of Jesus Christ dying on the cross for all of us? He died so that we all might live, and that is the epitome of the story of being our brother's keeper. But let's talk about life here on earth. If we are our brother's keeper, then it's our Christian responsibility to watch out for each other. The unborn is not a blob of tissue like some might tell you. You can't really see the unborn child at the moment of conception. But we're all doubting Thomases. We just had the story at my church last week of Thomas when, after Jesus rose from the dead, how Thomas had to put his hands into the wounds of Jesus to believe that he was real. We do that in the world of pro-life too. People have to see the ultrasound or see the pregnancy test to believe that that life is real, but it is life. Now, people will tell you it's not a baby, and I'm going to tell you it isn't a baby. Baby is a developmental term, but it's a human life. It's not a toddler. It's not a senior citizen either, but it is a human being. 12 weeks is about the time, 10 to 12 weeks, when most abortions happen, because usually a girl will miss her period and she won't believe that she's pregnant. It's going to go away. Something's wrong. So usually by the time she decides to have that abortion, it's 10 to 12 weeks. And that's the time that, I shouldn't say that's the time. A lot of girls in this country have not grown up with the values and the morals that they need to have. And so it's very easy for them thinking it must be legal, so it must be right. Or it is legal, so it must be right. And we need to change hearts and minds to understand that that is human life and it's not right. Now, our country was founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Our founding fathers rightly separated church from state, but they didn't separate God from state. They acknowledged that God is the source of all of our human rights. If you look at the Declaration of Independence, this paragraph we all know. It is the Declaration of Independence established our rights, and it says, you should know these words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Because they put Creator in, they established God as the founder of our basic human rights. You can't dispute that, and so many people want to. It's there. It's the law. Then the Constitution spells out how to protect those rights. In the very first line, in the preamble of the Constitution, it says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity." Those two little words, our posterity, that means for all those yet to come. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not 247 years old, or back when the Constitution was written, whenever back, I think it was in the late 1780s or something when it was ratified. But I wasn't born then. But our founding fathers put those two little words in there to protect me. So that should protect the unborn. And if that wasn't enough, we all know the story of what happened in the Civil War, how the rights of slaves didn't exist. They were property. So after the Civil War, after they were freed, the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. And that 14th Amendment says that no one may take away the right to life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now, anytime someone goes into an abortion clinic, I don't think there's a lawyer taking someone to court to let that baby die. That baby's rights are being ignored, or that human life, I should say, that human life's rights are being ignored. And that's happened so many times in our history. The Dred Scott decision before the Civil War, if any of you are history buffs, you know that our country, everybody was really glad to form this country. We have life and liberty, but our founding fathers had slaves. And so all men weren't created equal according to them. So there's a long, hard battle before the Civil War, and then the Supreme Court decided right before the Civil War that slaves were property. And we fought a long, hard war over it. It's kind of the same thing that happened with Roe v. Wade in 1973. The Supreme Court ignored the Declaration of Independence. They ignored the Constitution and the 14th Amendment, and they declared that women can have an abortion under a woman's right to privacy. And that's what you'll hear from people who are pro-choice today. They'll say that it's a woman's decision. A woman has the right to do what she wants to with her own body. And that's true. You can do what you want to, but that's somebody else's body. And we are our brother's keeper. We have always been our brother's keeper. And there's so many times that's ignored. We've become a nation that's really good at rationalizing away things when it becomes a problem to us. We don't teach values and moralities like we used to. Now, I'm not making a blanket statement about this church. It's just in general, because if you look at let's look at television today compared to what it was when I was a kid. I used to love watching Leave It to Beaver. And if you ever got into the parents' bedroom, they had pajamas, clipped up to their neck and robes on and twin beds. And you never saw them in bed together. And if you did, it was some conversation. The other one was way across on the other side of the room. Now, I'm not saying we need to revert to that, but what you see on TV today is not that at all. Someone goes out on the first date, and the next thing you know, the next morning they're waking up in bed together, and I don't need to go on from there. But if we allow it in our society all over, people think, well, it must be okay. I'm not a singer. I used to be in my youth, but not anymore. But I do hum along to songs. And one of my favorite songs over the last couple of years, you may know it was called "God, Why Don't You Do Something" by Matthew Kelly. And the words of that song said, can't quote him exactly, but he woke up one morning and he couldn't believe what our world was turning into. Children born in poverty, children sold into slavery. And he turned his eyes to heaven and said, "God, why don't you do something?" And God said, "I did. I created you." And that's where we come in, protecting life. We need to protect especially those who can't speak for themselves, the unborn, the disabled. People these days, as our technology advanced, which is really great, they'll do prenatal testings and decide if that child's not perfect, that they can get rid of the child. And who knows what perfect is? I try to tell my kids that I'm perfect, but they don't believe me. So we know that everyone is not perfect. So we need to protect them, and we need to do more than just say, somebody else will do it. And that song by Matthew Kelly says, in the verse it says, "If not me and you, if not us, then who? It's time for us to do something." And that means that we have to speak for the unborn. We have to speak for the disabled. In my job, we do a lot of things. We witness. We train people to witness outside abortion centers. I go to a lot of schools and churches just to teach about values and morality and life. I try to counteract what kids are learning in public schools, whether or not you know it. And I don't want to offend anybody here, because my message is of compassion, and God's message is of compassion, and people make mistakes, and people need healing. So if you've ever been involved in talking someone either into an abortion, or you think you're pro-life, but you never interfere with somebody else's rights, God forgives and heals. But the message that our kids are getting in schools, Planned Parenthood has a $75 billion grant from the federal government to teach responsible sex education in our schools. I took the textbooks with me once to the State House when I was testifying about a bill to defund Planned Parenthood. And the legislators that I showed them to in that committee were shocked. If your kids have been in those programs, you would be shocked to see what they're teaching, because it's not one of morality and values. It's of being happy, putting the right to happiness instead of the right to life and liberty first. And I teach in the schools, I says, we have a right to do what we want to. We have a right to human sexuality, but in every race, and every species, plants, animals, whatever, sex is for procreation. It's the beautiful gift that God gave us to extend our species. But humans are different than plants and animals. We have a soul and an intellect and a mind, and we know what could develop from sex. That is the creation of a life. And if you're not ready to create that life, if you're not ready to raise that child as a family, then you're not ready to have sex. It's black and white, and people will take that and they'll scream at me like I'm anti-woman, I'm this, I'm that. And those of you that are pro-life, Jill, you know this. Jill's been in the thick of it with me for a long time. We hear it all. Jeremiah 1:5 says, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." That gives value to every human life, from the womb to the tomb. And we can't rationalize that away. We can't rationalize it away with what Planned Parenthood teaches our kids. We can't be the ones that say, well, my kids aren't learning that. They go to private school, or their school doesn't teach that, because their friends are learning it. And we know we're a republic, not a democracy, or a Republican democracy, I should say, but it's not what's for the greater good. We have to do what's right. And the attitude of if you can't be careful, be good. If you can't be good, be careful, that's wrong. We have to watch out for life from the womb to the tomb. Family, marriage, that's all part of being pro-life. We're all called, and I'm sure you've learned this, that we're all called to be priests, prophets, and kings. A priest is one who sacrifices on behalf of others or himself. We do that every day when we preach pro-life, because you know that you're going to get raked over the coals, and believe me, I've been raked over the coals a lot. A prophet's one who teaches others the way that they should live so as to avoid evil and embrace the good. And that's the hard part about it, trying to teach people that something is good for them. I remember my mom telling me I had to do something because I said so, and it's good for you, and you learn when you get older. Well, I did. I didn't want to wait, but a lot of kids today won't wait. And then a king is a shepherd, one who governs and uses his authority so that others may be brought to the fullness of their potential. And that's what we expect in our elected officials. That's why the power of going to the polls is so important, to elect legislators who will protect life, because that's what the Constitution says, that's what the Bible says. Everything's about life. We all know in Matthew tells us that we have two great commandments. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. That means looking out for all those that are the weakest of us. Our Constitution and our government is founded on these principles. We can't deny that. But so many today are persecuting the Christian way of life in everything. You know all the stuff that's going on in the news these days against Christians. But that's what our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence was founded on. We can't throw them away. And we can't wait for someone else to do something. It's time for us to do something. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to Denise. I'm now going to let Dr. Sloan give a few-minute response.
Thank you, Denise. That was wonderful. Denise has brought to our attention the issue of life and valuing life, especially of the unborn. I want us to think about the culture that we are within, of our thoughts toward life in general. And just one scripture, as a preacher, I always look for one-liners. And I think one of the best sermons that I have found is actually in Scripture. I just love where Peter preaches after healing the lame man in Acts 3. And here are the words that he says. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Jesus. You handed him over to be killed, And you disowned him before Pilate, though he had decided to let him go. You disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. Listen to those words. Jesus is said to be the author of life. And the greatest sin that has ever been committed in the history of humanity is the murder of the author of life. Jesus, when he walked in this world, he saw life and he valued it. People that most people wouldn't recognize, wouldn't notice. Even Peter here, he says these words after healing a lame man. I find it interesting that the lame man isn't named. How many people knew his name? They knew the name of the gate where he sat. What was the name of the lame man? Or when Jesus heals a man born blind, what was his name? Did people see him? Jesus saw him. Jesus spoke to him. Jesus recognized him. And afterwards, as Jesus is addressing the religious leaders who challenged him, he said, "The thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And so as Christians, we want to recognize that God values life. And any devaluing of life is an affront to the Creator, to the author of life. Just as the murder of Jesus was the greatest sin in the history of humanity, the murder of someone created in the image of God is the same. And murder can be active, it can be passive. Perhaps we wouldn't call that murder. But there are many issues related to life where we have questions about what do we do in a particular situation? Is it okay to assist someone in committing suicide? And when we ask questions like this, we start to devalue life. We say, at a certain age, this person becomes less valuable. And a person in a certain condition is less valuable. And, we can look at some of the, maybe one of the greatest sins in the history of humanity is what happened in Nazi Germany 80 years ago. And what that was a devaluing of life. A certain race is to be valued above others. As Christians, we need to be concerned about anything that would devalue anyone, whether it's the unborn, whether it's the elderly, whether it's those with particular illnesses. And we want to ask questions about how are we as a culture valuing life, not the pursuit of happiness, but life.
Thank you, David, for those comments. And Denise, appreciated your words. I want to pull us back to a concept, just a very simple, a simple concept. And it was found, I think, in the book of Genesis chapter 1. And I call this concept God's bias towards life. There is a bias in God towards life. He creates life. This bias leads him to create a world, a universe where life is possible. He creates trees. He pays attention to the creeping things, the flying things, the things in the water. And then he comes to human beings, which is really special. Of course, Joel pointed out the fact that God makes man, or fashions human beings in his image and likeness, which is a very unique distinction. But I also want you to notice, when you go a little further in the passage, down to Genesis 1:31, it says, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. It's interesting. 2 other times he says, it was good. At least 2 other times. In verse 9, at least verse 10, and then in verse 25, God saw it was good. But it seems that only when humanity is created, then he can say, okay, now it is very good. Tells us something that human beings are crucial and important. And so people who are made in God's image and in God's likeness, we too ought to have the same bias towards life. It is a bias of our Creator, and so as those created in His image, we ought to have this same bias. In fact, I would argue that we are never closer to God than when we too have this bias towards life. Going a step further, and this may get into some controversial territory, but I hope it isn't too controversial. When we are procreating, there's no other time in our lives when we are closer to God, or closer to God's image. We are doing something that it seems only God can do. In procreation, we are bringing a life into existence, which of course leads us to think about how we treat sexuality in our culture. That it is like scratching your nose, or it's like, I have an itch, so let me scratch it. That is the culture, right? It's just a physical need, but it's far more than that, because in a Christian worldview, procreation brings us as close as we can possibly get, I think, to being like our Creator. I want to also, just lastly though, speak a little bit about the span of life. Sometimes a lot of energy, emotional, physical, spiritual, financial, political, is spent on the beginning and the end, right? But we have to be very careful. I think in some of our debates, we spend too much time trying to work at the ends of the spectrum, and we ignore the middle, the very important middle. This is a frustration to me as a theologian, as a thinker, as a Christian, because it seems as though, let's bring the kids into the world and, okay, you're on your own now, and you figure it out, but where's the help? And I'm getting very practical. A young woman comes and she is pregnant. She doesn't know what to do. And typically what I've heard people say, well, you shouldn't get an abortion. Great. Who's going to help me raise this child? You see, again, as Christians, we have a responsibility. This bias towards life is not just about abortion or euthanasia. This bias towards life, it's all the things in between. Things like justice, social justice, economic justice, things like food security, education. I know these are typically topics that you don't normally hear in the same conversation, but they ought to be in the same conversation, because if we say we're Christians and we say we have this bias towards life, then this bias towards life leads us to protect it in the beginning and at the end, but also in the glorious middle. Right? This is, to me, what we ought to be looking at. Not just a matter of quantity, and I'll move another step further. It's not just a matter of quantity of life. Well, you're alive, thank God. Well, that's great. You lived 70 years. Wonderful. But what about quality of life? Now, I understand this gets into some nebulous area, but we also have to be concerned about quality of life as well. If we are saying as Christians that we have this bias towards life, and that God has created a universe with a bias towards life, then we ought to be saying, how can we not only deal with the beginning and the end, but also how can we improve the quality of life for everyone? This is not a left issue or a right issue. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is a Christian issue. And I think we need, as Christians, to move beyond the polarization that we see in our politics and our culture, and to say, okay, yes, both are true. We do need social and economic justice, but we also need to value the beginning and the end of life. Thank you.
We're going to move to our question and answer time. And what we'll do is you can just lift a hand. I'll come to you. I'm going to hang on to the microphone. And as I said before, try to be as punctiliar as you can in asking your question. If you have a specific question for one of the panelists, you can just say that, or you can just have it in general to all the panelists. Who'd like to begin? Well, Dahlia, okay.
He won't let me touch the microphone because he knows. Okay, my question is, just recently, Brittany Maynard had assisted physician suicide in Oregon. She had a brain tumor, and she did not want to go through the process of, they told her what she would go through, the pain. So she chose to move to Oregon and have the doctors give her pills, and she took her life. And so I would like all three of you to respond to just what you think of that, because a lot of people say it's a merciful thing for her to be allowed to do that. But I'd like to hear from you what you think biblically, what God thinks of that.
Yeah, just turn it off.
Use this one. That can be a very loaded question. We have lots of pain and stress and anxiety in our lives, and we don't always know what's going to happen. God knows our every move, but He created us with the free will. So that's why people will choose to avoid the pain. And I've had people tell me, when it comes my time, I don't want to go through that pain. But we don't know what's going to happen. There's just as many cases of people like Brittany that people lived several years longer and lived very fruitful lives. And I can't judge the quality of her life. I'm not in the position to judge. I can't judge the usefulness of her life, because life should not be judged by how well you are, what you can do, how you can prosper. You know, you often hear about death panels in Obamacare and things like that. We can't judge that. And for Brittany to take her own life, I'm not going to judge. She's going to have to stand before God and talk to Him. But what she did was try to uphold that as the right thing to do to everybody else, and it's a slippery slope. Some people will say they have a duty to die rather than the right to die, and who makes that decision? Some people will say, take your life because taking care of you, it's going to be long and hard, it's going to be harder on us, so go ahead and take your life. God created us, and I don't think we have the right to take that life away. I believe, and our organization as well believes, that in palliative care, let you live until you die.
There's a story in Scripture, the story of Job, where Job suffers terribly. And at one point his wife comes to him and she says to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." And Job's response is, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" I think those words are very instructive here. What we're hearing in this case, and this isn't a problem with one individual who made the wrong choice, but this is a cultural phenomenon where we as a culture do not value life, we value comfort. And the story of Job shows a man who would not curse God, who would not bring his life to an end, because he recognized that good comes from God, and sometimes God has us walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's painful. And we serve a Messiah who walked that same path, who at one point was in such turmoil that he said, "Oh, Father, if it is possible, remove this cup from me, or if not my will, but yours be done." He says, "Anything is possible for you. Would you remove this cup from me?" He experienced a great suffering. He was in agony. And Christians throughout history have suffered greatly. The Apostle Paul He says, "Let no one trouble me, for I bear on my body the marks of Christ." He suffered greatly for Jesus. And for him, he recognized that in some way he was participating in the sufferings of Jesus. And what we need to do to those, or for those who are suffering, is to remind them that they are experiencing something that Jesus experienced here. There was a couple times when Renee was sharing that he talked about how in times when we are never closer to God than these specific times. One of those times would be when we suffer. That we experience something, and if we avoid pain, if we avoid suffering in life, we haven't really lived. And so part of being pro-life is being pro-life, even if at times it means great suffering.
Great answers, both panelists. I want to just say three really brief things. I think first, on a pastoral level, I think Brittany Maynard left no room for God or for the miraculous. And sometimes we can feel that hopeless. We can feel as though all hope is gone. But as Christians, we believe that God does perform miracles and that God can change situations and circumstances around. Let me also quickly say, though, that self-determination is an important Christian and civil right, okay? But that doesn't mean we're not accountable. It's like Spider-Man, Uncle Ben told him, with great power comes great responsibility, right? The same is true here. God has given us a right to self-determination, but there's going to be a judgment. I don't know what Brittany Maynard's situation is, but this is something key to understand. We are often quick to jump into people's private affairs, and I am very cautious as a Christian. Because we don't know all that's happening, all that's going on, and the media is very good at spinning all kinds of different tales. Okay. Having said that, euthanasia is a huge issue. Euthanasia comes from two kind of Greek words, which basically mean good death. Right. The idea is to have a good death. But not all euthanasia is the same. There's theorists separate between active euthanasia and passive euthanasia. Active euthanasia is that there's actually killing involved. But that's different from passive euthanasia, which is letting die. Okay? So I think it's very important when we use these terms like euthanasia, you have to recognize that there is a difference between actively killing and letting die. There's also a difference between voluntary and involuntary forms of euthanasia. Right? Something that we don't often think about. And I must shudder to bring it up in this conversation, but I think it's important. Many of us here are people who are on morphine, right? And to deal with pain. What is not often understood or recognized is that the amounts of morphine that are given to people to let them die comfortably or to ease their passing is actually, the doses are lethal. And actually what kills them is very often the morphine itself, right? So typically it is happening far more often than you may imagine that people are given lethal doses of medication, okay? And so this is it is a challenge. I'm just trying to make it muddy. I don't want it to be too clear and clean, because death is not clear and clean. It is messy business. I worked in a nursing home for years, and I've seen the messiness of death. So I don't want to, and I've seen the agony that children and loved ones go through when they have to make a very, very difficult decision. So you have granddad who is in the very, very advanced stages of Alzheimer's. What do you do? He is in pain now because his body organs are shutting down, and the doctor says, well, let's ease his pain. What's happening? Those drugs are actually killing him too. Okay? So it's not so neat, and it's not so clean. Then we have to consider matters like heroic versus non-heroic interventions. There is a difference, I think, really between killing someone who may be not dying at the point and actually pulling the plug, for example. There are times, I think, or desire to live, to keep someone around far, it's out of proportion. And sometimes I think we have to be very careful. These are tough decisions. The person has been brain dead for a long time. We don't know if they're going to come back. We have to be very sympathetic, concerned, loving, and not just simply say, well, we killed this person. I've seen this happen. And Christians saying, well, you killed your grandfather. There is, again, this distinct difference between killing and letting die. And I think we have to be very, in Brittany Maynard's case, and in all these other cases, we should be very cautious.
Another question. Okay, Nick and the two of you together? Okay.
What kind of case would you make to someone that's not a Christian? Now, obviously, I'm pro-life, but to someone that, like, God isn't even in the picture, because we don't tell people they can't drink because being drunk is wrong, or, you know what I mean? So, like, to make a case that it should be wrong nationwide, like, how would you speak to a non-Christian?
It's very easy for me. Let me use the case. A couple of weeks ago, you may have heard in the news when the chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, was challenged by Rand Paul about abortion, and he asked her, is the killing of a 7-pound infant in the womb, should it be legal? And her answer was that the government should never interfere in the decision of a woman, ever. End of story, period, is what she said. So my answer on that is, if you don't want to talk about religion, you just want to talk about legality, then let's follow her line of reasoning. So you shouldn't interfere with the life of that child before it's born. Why should you interfere with the life of it after it's born? Because it's if you have a child after it's born, let's say that 7-pound baby is born, your child is born, and you stop feeding it because you're just tired of every time she cries feeding her. So don't feed her. So why should the government get involved? It's your child, it's not their child. So why should they arrest you for child endangerment? And let's take that further. Why should there be child support? Why should there be stoplights? Why should there be a government? I mean, we are a brother's keeper. That is biblical, but it's also a law that benefits everyone, that we have to watch out for each other or we'd have chaos. So if you don't want to talk religion, let's just talk government. I'll match you word for word.
Speak to that just really briefly. I think one of the ways I talk to people about this is that the devaluation of one life devalues us all. I think this is a very important argument to make. When we devalue one life at whatever stage, we are actually saying to ourselves, we're not that valuable, we're not that important. So I think that's a key argument. But here's a story my uncle used to tell years ago, really, really brief. He said this woman had 6 children, and she went to a doctor. She was pregnant with the 7th, and she wanted to have an abortion. The doctor was a Christian. And she said to the doctor, "Doc, I'm going to have an abortion because we can't afford to feed this next child." So the doctor says to her, "Well, why don't you just kill one of the others then? If it's just a matter of economics, right, and bring this one to life." And she said, "No, I could never kill my child." Sometimes it's so,